this is Grandmaster Sam Shanklin, and today I'd like to start a new series where I talk a little bit about the Queen's Gambit decline. So the Queen's Gambit decline proper starts d4, d5, c4, d6. And it's been a very popular opening for a very long time. It's an opening with black that I have, to be honest, have not really added to my repertoire. It's one of the few things with black I don't play against d4. One of the reasons I don't really play it is because I view it more as a drawing weapon, although there's somewhat of a prejudice involved there. I've definitely seen black win some good games in the Queen's Gambit declines, but I'm not quite at the point yet where I'm routinely getting invited to round-robin tournaments where really drawing with black is a huge goal, and I'm often still being a little ambitious with black pieces. In any case, I've done some work on it, and I'll try to share with you what I've learned. This kind of thing it's very good for people who want to play solidly, and just because I think of it more as a drawing weapon, it doesn't mean that you can't win games. There's still room to make mistakes. So in this first video, I'm just going to sort of do a quick survey of the various things white can try, and then as we get further into the series, I'll sort of take them apart one by one. So there's just some sidelines, like there's knight f3. White can play something like e3, aiming for some kind of symmetrical deal, but, well, I'm certainly unimpressed by this. c5 is very playable here, although I think b6 is also quite acceptable as well, for those who want to go into the semi-Slav without having to be concerned about bishop g5. You can start with c6, but I like the move b6 the most, to be honest. It strikes me as the most flexible. Black is quickly ready to play bishop b7, and well, he'll play c5 then. And if you compare this to a pretty standard semi-Slav, like oftentimes, I know there's some pretty decent recommendation by Boris Avrukh in his book, b3, knight b7, b2, and we get some business like this, b6, knight c3, and white quickly plays knight e5 and tries to support it with f4 and create a kingside attack, and black's always playing c5. So this is semi-Slav, which seems to be a little bit off topic, but my point is that if black plays b6 in this position, he's going to get the same thing, almost always a tempo up, because it won't take him. He can just play c5 in one move instead of two. For the most part, I think this is absolutely fine for black. White also can play the Catalan, which is more than just a sideline. It's the way of life that a lot of people are professing. But I'm not sure if I'm going to cover this or not. Maybe we'll do that later. But it really sort of, I would say, falls outside the scope of the Queen's Gambit decline proper. So, what would really signify it would be the move knight c3. And now, well, black has some options. There's bishop d4, which is the Rogozin variation. I don't think we're going to cover this in the series. This is really something completely different. It's also something that commonly comes out of the Nimzo Indian instead. And there's c6, which transposes back to the semi-Slav. These are both fine moves. D takes c4 is the Vienna variation, also a fine move. I don't know, maybe we'll cover d takes c4. I think that sort of falls into Queen's Gambit decline territory, but really the main Queen's Gambit decline move is bishop to e7. With this move, black's simply trying to castle, and white is usually playing either bishop f4 or bishop g5 here. And there's a fair amount of theory. In both cases, I think it's often ending very close to equality after some forcing sequences. Okay, knight c3, though, is sort of all the rage these days. Black has, again, a few options. There's this funny move c5, which could lead to the Tarrasch variation with cd, ed, and knight f3, something like this. I don't have a very high opinion of Tarrasch, although I was actually somewhat impressed by a book that came out on Tarrasch recently by, I think it was Jacob Agard and one other guy I'm forgetting. But it was in the Grandmaster Repertoire series, although it didn't take me too long to find some flaws in their analysis. And again, I do think white is better in the Tarrasch variation. So we're not going to really cover that. It's really mainly going to be black's weapons against in the standard Queen's Gambit decline. So for a while, we're playing the move knight f6 here, but I'm not really a fan of this because after c takes d5, e takes d5. Knight takes d5, by the way, I think is an underrated move. After e4, knight takes c3 and c5. we get to sort of like a Grunfeld-like position, but well, black's going to play bishop d4, check and trade some pieces as opposed to try to destroy the center right away. There was some game in the last round of the Olympiad in this line. I want to say it was 𝐓𝐡𝐞 or something like that, where black held a very easy draw. Okay, certainly not to be underestimated. Maybe we'll cover that. Maybe we won't. I'll have to get authorization from Papa Bear to see how long this series is going to go. In any case, so after e takes d5, which is sort of more normal, bishop g5. I think this position's better for white because I mean there's still obviously a lot of game to be played, but I think for the most part white's doing quite well in these positions because he's managed to develop his knight and his bishop to their most harmonious squares right away. And his next moves are going to be e3, bishop d3, knight g2, probably castle short, but I've definitely seen castles long before. And then white will play for f3 and e4. So to put an example on the board, let's say c6, e3, I think bishop e7, bishop d3. Okay, Botulin put bishop g4 against me here in the last video I covered, but let's say just castles. Knight ge2, knight bd7. These are all sort of standard QGD moves. And something like now queen d2, and white's getting ready to play rook a e1, f3, e4. I think white has a nice position. So what black's mainly doing nowadays to avoid this, well, okay, well, I should also mention c6, which would go back to the semi-Slav, or the Marshall Gambit even. Like here we could play e3 or knight f3 and get semi-Slav, but after e4 we've got the psychotic Marshall Gambit, which I, to be honest, know very little about, so I don't think I feel qualified to cover that. But bishop e7 is the main move. Now the real point of bishop e7 is to sort of switch up the move order because we know that the bishop's going to go there anyway to try to force white to make some kind of concession. And indeed we'll see this does pretty much force a concession on white's part. So basically what he wanted to do is play c takes d5, bishop g5, e3, bishop d3, knight ge2. But the problem is, in order for this plan to work, bishop g5 absolutely has to be the first move. Because he can't play e3 before bishop g5. This will keep his bishop stuck on c1. And he can't play bishop d3 without this pawn moving. And he can't bring the knight to e2 without that. So white has to make some kind of concession here. And that concession can be in the form of knight f3, which after knight f6, we got back to a position we previously discussed. And white is unable to set up the bishop g5 with knight e2. Or I think more common nowadays is c takes d5, e takes d5, bishop f4. But this is a very critical wasted tempo, and I think that black often has extremely good chances to equalize here. For example, okay, c6 is a move, knight f6 is a move. There's some line that was featured a lot in the U.S. Women's Championship a couple of years ago, knight f6, e3, and now bishop f5. And then it was going queen b3, knight c6, and black was relying on active pieces in a lead in development to compensate for what could be serious pawn deficit on the queen side. I've looked into this a fair amount, actually, and I'm actually not totally sure it's so bad for black. I mean, it looks like 2 pawns, but I couldn't find anything great. And in those U.S. women's games, white was playing g4, and then we got some endgame here. And the jury is still out on the verdict here, but my impression is that black is not doing so badly. So that's one way black can play. I think sort of the more authorized prescribed way these days is c6, and then after e3, black is choosing between bishop f5, which is more active. I think we've seen Aronian play this a couple times. Remember, he's actually lost a couple of bad games. I think he lost this position to Carlsen and Tata Steel. He lost to Nakamura in Home Memorial, maybe, or London, I forget. But bishop f5 was that. There's bishop d6, which is sort of a strange move, wasting a tempo, but I don't think it's so bad because the position's locked up and it's hard to do much for white. So, yeah, that's sort of one thing. I don't really think we're going to cover bishop d6 that closely. It's more of a drawing weapon, and I've been told for the most part I'm not recording videos for players stronger than me, and those are really the people who should be looking at the moves like bishop d6. But bishop f5 is the standard move, and then there's some crazy stuff with g4, and then bishop back, bishop d3. We'll cover all this stuff in future videos. So I guess to continue this video, I'll start off by showing, starting off by covering the move bishop g5 in this position. And this is sort of out of popularity now, probably for good reason. It's not seeming to give much edge. And I'll start off by covering sideline, which is, I think, the 𝐶 variation. h6, bishop h4, castles, e3, and now the move b6. And knight e4 is all the rage here, and I do think it's the best move. But we'll cover b6 for today, which, to be honest, I still haven't found anything great against. So this is the 𝐶 variation. Black has a pretty natural idea that he just wants to play bishop b7, knight bd7, and develop his pieces normally. White has a few options here. One is, well, so let's say c takes d5, knight takes d5, knight d5, e5, bishop e7, queen e7. This is sort of the most forcing line, aiming to immediately highlight the drawbacks of this b6 move. If this pawn were still on b7, Black would have a very fine position, because he would play c6, and bishop f5 or bishop g4, knight d7. A very harmonious development, no pawn weaknesses, and be totally fine. But because this pawn's on b6, we've got a backward c pawn. So, for example, like after rook c1, c5, I think there's some takes, queen a4. And this position, I don't know, the jury is still out, but I think recently Black's been demonstrating equality without a ton of trouble. There was some game, I want to say Nakamura against Carlsen from Bosnia, and I think we won like bishop e6, queen a3, knight d7. Black ended up with a very fine position, and he equalized without a ton of trouble. One theme that Black often has to keep in mind in these positions, which is a little strange, is he can often advance the move c4, which looks weird because it'll give up this d4 square and really make the d5 pawn backwards, but oftentimes the pressure he gets on the b file is very much worth it. I think that's what happened in the Nakamura-Carlsen game. Well, Carlsen made an easy draw. These kinds of positions, like let's say, I don't know, bishop d5, rook fc8, no, castles, and let's say Black plays a move like king f8. I think this is exactly how the Nakamura-Carlsen game went. Black is preparing to play c4, which will lead us to an endgame. And we'll say, I don't know, rook fd1 might avoid that. No, knight b6, keeping everything protected, and, well, we're ready to play c4 next, and I think Black often has a fine position. Just to demonstrate what this might look like. h3, c4, take, knight d4. And, okay, this does look unappealing at first sight, at least it does to me, but let's say, like, a6 we'll start with. This bishop already is short on squares. In fact, the bishop might get into trouble. Here, rook b8. And for the most part, I think Black should be absolutely fine. It looks to me like White's got dynamic issues as well as static ones, and I don't necessarily think that d5 is any weaker than b2. And if White were to play a move like b3, probably with just one isolated pawn and the whole queen side getting liquidated, Black wouldn't have any serious concerns. Although even still, after b3, let's say a move like a5, it's not totally clear what White's doing. It seems to me that Black's fine. Maybe he'll play a4 or something. So, that I don't think is very dangerous. One line I do think is a little bit more poisonous is the move rook c1. I actually played this move once against Eric Rosen in the U.S. Junior Championship. I think I covered that video a long time ago. Covered that game in a video a long time ago. Bishop b7. And now White voluntarily exchanges off the bishop pair with bishop takes f6. And you might wonder why he played bishop back to h4 and then bishop takes f6. And the point is that he's weakened this c file, and after he plays c takes d5, Black can recapture this way, in which case this bishop would likely be better placed back on c8. And now takes, we exchange these guys, and now in order to prevent c5, White can play the move b4. This line I think is a little poisonous for Black, but I haven't actually been able to find anything super convincing either for White. It seems that Black You could equalize. I think queen d6 is a good move to start with. Say queen b3, knight b7. I have a feeling black will get c5 in, and he shouldn't be in such bad shape. One key theme is to play a5 and then c5. So let's say, I don't know, bishop e2. Black could play move like a5. Or wait, did I just blunder knight b5? Yeah, I did. Okay, so probably something was a little fishy here. Okay, well maybe we can say start with queen d6, and then after queen b3, you can even play a move like c6. And I actually think that one key theme might be, let's say, I don't know, bishop d3. Play the move b5. Now, I don't know if we can do it quite yet, because maybe e4 is a problem. But the point of b5 is, let's say we were to play nonchalantly, is you just play a5 very quickly. And you've got one bad piece, this bishop, but you're really putting pressure on the white queen side. For example, let's say a3, takes. Okay, bishop back to e7. And we're putting a ton of pressure on this b4 pawn. Rook b1, knight a6. And I think it's pretty clear that if this white knight gets relegated to a2, black definitely cannot be worse. Another theme black could play is the move knight to d7, with the idea to play knight b6 and then put this knight on c4. And in order to combat this pawn, white almost always has to play e4 to open up the center. And then there's some interesting play. Other possibility for black would be to just get c5 in right away. Let's say knight d7, bishop e2, and okay, c5 directly. And okay, we get some position like bc, bc, and knight d4. And white optically might seem somewhat better because of this isolated d5 pawn, but with the active bishop pair and the open queenside files, I don't think black should be worse. I think this is quite fine. The one thing I would be careful of is pawn structures where white gets his pawn to b5. Like, let's say after bishop d3, black were to play a5, b5, and now c5. Okay, first of all, I think that some b takes c6 probably is quite good for white. Some takes, and like bishop b5. This looks quite pleasant. But just to illustrate the point, what you really should be concerned about is a pawn structure like this one. I think this has the potential to be quite nice for white because the c4 pawn is well blockaded by the knight on c3. The bishop on b7 is quite poorly placed, and he's probably going to have to stay there to defend the d5 pawn. Now, white's already threatening the move. Like, let's say black were to play like queen e7. Already after knight a4, black's lost. So it just shows that like a natural move could turn out badly. Probably black's best plan would be to try to reroute this bishop to d6 and put the knight on f6, but that's a little slow. And again, after something like this, knight a4, we're threatening to capture on d7 and then knight on b6, so the knight would have to move. And now knight e5, and I'm just not really a huge fan of this position for black. I think white looks to be quite happy. Say, I don't know, g6, bishop h3, and this knight is still stuck here because knight d7 is a problem. And I don't know, somehow this seems difficult for black. It's hard for him to organize his pieces properly. Like, let's say, I don't know, I mean, like, maybe knight d7, like, maybe you could play, like, rook e8, hoping to try to avoid some knight d7. But after, like, g3, this bishop will come back to g2 and put pressure here. Bishop d6, f4 never helped anyone. I don't know, these positions always seemed a little dubious for black to me. So that's the one thing to be careful of is oftentimes the structure where we get a5 and then d5, c5, I think can be good for white. And that's one of the main reasons that I like playing this way for white sometimes, is because this sort of obvious way to play for black often turns out poorly. Conversely, though, if white were to play a move like b5, here black has an opportunity to play a6, and I think this really solves a lot of his problems. If that pawn were forced all the way up to b5, I think white would have a nice position. But let's say a6, a4, c5, I think black's doing quite fine here. So that sort of concludes the part on this, I'll say, on the Tartakower variation. I know there's a little bit more to it, but for the most part, I think black's doing well. And I think those are the only two really challenging lines, because everything else, like, I think they're doing like bishop d3, and then like takes, and we get pretty similar stuff to before. It's the same ideas with like d7, c5, and well, I think black's doing quite fine there. So I guess we'll cover one more brief thing, and that's if white captures on f6. I think this is just really fishy. Here, castle, bishop d3, let's say, and now just c6, and black's going to play knight d7. So castles, knight d7. And basically, no matter what white does, black next move is going to play d takes c4, and then after bishop takes c4, he'll play e5, and, well, black opens up the center, trades a bunch of pawns, he doesn't have any bad pieces, and he'll be absolutely fine. I don't even think it's worth going over anything more than this. I've seen white go nuts here with the move h4, and then g4, but I think after a common collective move g6, probably white's worse. Black will just play bishop g7, and the king side won't get opened. Conversely, though, the center will get opened, and white's going to feel that big. All right, so this sort of covered the sidelines of the bishop g5 variation. Next, we'll move on to main lines. So until then, this is Sam Shanklin signing off.